Today, we are talking about freedom. We're going to wade into the murky waters and look at the question of how do you strike a balance between you having lots of opportunities to be free as an individual versus having some restrictions placed on you so that the we can be more free as a community or society? How do we balance the freedom of the me with the freedom of the we? And by the end of this video, you will have a better understanding of the context in which our current freedom discussion takes place. If you are a part of the book club, which you can learn more about in the description below, this video complements week 2's scheduled readings of Being Good, A Short Introduction to Ethics by Simon Blackburn. Let's talk freedom. In the last video, we talked about the 7 threats to ethics, with the first being the death of God. That without religion serving as the foundation of what is good and bad, right and wrong, it can leave us wondering, what does serve as that foundation, and how do we come to collective agreements? This apparent lack of cohesion of what serves to create the standards of ethics and standards of freedom, one might say, is what German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was talking about in his cautionary statement, God is dead. Today, we're going to expand off that in relation to freedom. In order to do that, we need to go back through a couple key moments in history to set the stage. As Johann Bauern said in The Philosophy of Leisure, time periods are the historical bedrock in which ideas slumber. Let's start with Aristotle. Next month in the book club, we're reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. But Aristotle wrote about all sorts of different topics, including freedom and democracy. Aristotle highlighted 2 key things regarding freedom. One was that to be a slave to another person meant you aren't free. You can't do what you would like to do, and you have to do what they would like you to do. The second was that if you were under an authoritarian or totalitarian government or some form of tyranny, you also aren't free because you aren't free to contribute to the decision of the collective freedoms. Therefore, democracy, where everyone gets a say in what freedom should look like, is best. So there's your freedom as an individual, and then there's the freedom of society, which you are a part of and which you are a part of shaping. And the goal becomes to strike a balance. You can't have total individual freedom in order for the society, and in turn you as well, to have certain collective freedoms. You having total freedom could quickly become a problem for someone else's freedom. If you have the freedom to go around stealing stuff, that takes away someone else's freedom to property and security of their stuff. This balance on individual freedoms and collective freedoms is what largely shapes society and in turn a lot of our day-to-day experiences. And these aren't concepts in opposition, but rather in nuanced relation. Aristotle helped lay the foundation, in addition to Plato and others, but let's now jump forward to the 1600s and meet our next key player, John Locke. So we're now in the 1600s, and English philosopher and political theorist John Locke is fed up with the lingering effects of the feudal system and the divine rights of the monarchy of England. Coming off the Renaissance and scientific revolution, people had began to prioritize human reasoning over religious dictation, and overall there was a bit of an anti-authoritarian perspective going on. There was this idea that natural laws discovered by reason, apply to all people, while divine laws are only discovered through God's disclosure and really only applies to those who God discloses these laws to, if at all. Side note, the natural laws applying to all people deserves a huge asterisk for obvious reasons. People went on to use this natural law idea to justify a lot of terrible things. But it was this idea that, look, this divine law stuff isn't what should structure society. Human reasoning and natural laws are the way to do this, which led to the monarchy of England to be questioned. The idea of a king having divine rights seemed outdated. It just doesn't seem to reason that a king has rights ordained by God. Locke argued that humans have natural rights, that these natural and individual rights exist prior to and independently of the government. The rights he highlighted were of life, liberty, and property. Basically, that we have these duties to others, and these include not to kill, enslave, or steal. These duties and rights shape into what is called deontology. and forms a lot of what we think about in terms of justice and law still today. We won't talk much specifically about that today, but it's important to highlight for future thought. And Locke thought humans, in a state of nature, had a liberty or freedom to engage in what he called innocent delights, which basically meant enjoying your desires within the limits of natural law, meaning you can pursue your delights as long as you don't kill, enslave, or steal in the process. And if you do, that is the role of government. Government should exist to uphold these rights. Someone infringes on them, the government punishes that person. And that these governments should exist by the consent of the people for the purpose of protecting the rights of those people. And if a government doesn't hold their end of the bargain, they can and should be resisted and replaced with a new one. This consenting relationship for the government to have this power is like a type of social contract. Like, look, we'll give up some of our freedom in order for you, the government, to ensure someone doesn't try to act like they're free to infringe on any of these rights. So we have the natural laws, which provide us with the rights of life, liberty, and property. And the role of the government should be to stay out of things unless someone is infringing on someone else's rights. And this government should only exist by the consent of the people, so they can decide whether or not the government is doing a good job. And that's why Locke is considered the father of liberalism. Not to be confused with liberal parties of government. Classical liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on the rights of an individual, liberty, consent of the governed, political equality, equality before the law, and the right to private property. All stuff Locke was talking about. This was in opposition or contrast to tradition. It was the idea that conserving tradition wasn't in the best interests of the people. So that's Locke and liberalism. People have individual rights, and they should be able to act freely so long as they don't infringe on other people's individual rights. That's how we function as a we. You give up the freedom to do anything that infringes on the rights of others. And this was a big deal. This idea that an effective government is one that is a social contract between the people and the government, and the purpose is to defend these human rights and give the people freedom otherwise, was huge. Lots of other political theorists and philosophers before, during, and after Locke contributed to this idea. And it played a big role in the American, French, and Haitian revolutions through the late 1700s, and all sorts of revolts against colonial rule across the globe. Now, before we move on, I want to introduce a term that can spark some debate. If you're familiar with the debate around this term, bear with me. We will address it as we go. But I think it's a term that can help us understand freedom and how it's accomplished. That what Locke and others were advocating for here is what's called negative freedom. That what liberalism was promoting was negative freedom, or freedom from external constraints imposed by others, particularly the government. That individuals were responsible for their own lives, choices, and property, and governance and authorities would make sure they were able to do so without imposition. You can see how the idea of what's ethical is closely tied to this idea of freedom. Because of these rights, it would be seen as unethical to infringe on them. These two concepts are closely related. In 1704, the father of liberalism, John Locke, died. And a short 19 years later, in 1723, the father of economics was born, Scottish social philosopher and political economist Adam Smith. Let's take a look at how he contributed to freedom. Just like how Locke's ideas were largely an argument against the flaws he saw in the lingering feudal system, where people lacked the ability to have private property and various forms of liberty, Adam Smith's ideas can be seen in the context of arguing against mercantilism. Much oversimplified, mercantilism was an economic theory and approach common during this time. The thought was that the world's wealth is fixed. So a way to increase your nation's wealth was to export more than you imported, and this would bring much gold and silver back home. To accomplish this, they used an approach that actually might be on your radar right now: tariffs. You put high tariffs on manufactured goods to restrict imports. So with this in mind, the ideas of liberalism gaining traction, Adam Smith was ready to do his thing. And you might be thinking, we're about to jump into his famous work, The Wealth of Nations. But we need to look at his work that preceded this, because it contains a critical element for his Wealth of Nations book to make sense. See, Smith suggested the reason liberalism works and the government can be hands-off except for extreme circumstances is that as humans, we have what he called moral sentiments. What Smith suggests is that sympathy is the foundation of human morality. Sympathy being the capacity to understand and share the feelings of others, leading to mutual concern and cooperation. Some might say empathy would be a more correct word to use, but you get the idea. This emotional connection fosters social harmony and forms the basis of moral judgments. It's the why and how that we can come together as a society or community. What Smith goes on to say is that people's economic behaviors, even if you give them the freedom to go about it based on their own self-interest, operate within this framework of social norms that's shaped by sympathy or these moral sentiments. So, hey, government, just like how society does better if you get out of the way and people are free to do as they please, and as a government, you just make sure nobody infringes on other people's rights, things would also be better if we structure things so that people can pursue their own self-interests economically. Because of these social norms we've been talking about, it will inadvertently create market mechanisms that promote the common good. That'll work because those mechanisms are a part of a moral order of trust, fairness, and ethical conduct because of this sympathy. Then came his famous work, The Wealth of Nations, and argued that we should have a form of free markets, and this alongside this liberal philosophy of minimal government interference and people's right to property set up this commercial society, as Smith put it, and that it is essential for prosperity and social progress, that we should have an economic negative freedom, that individuals should be free from any unnecessary government regulation in their economic activities. You might be thinking, okay, so then he wrote a book called Capitalism, right? No, that term came later. But the system of capitalism is in a way what he was advocating for. Smith died in 1790, and shortly after, in the beginning of the 19th century, English philosopher and political theorist and politician John Stuart Mill was born in 1806. John Stuart Mill is going to be the last specific person we cover before we speed things up and cover some key concepts that bring us up to the present day. And the reason we're talking about these four people specifically in this first part of the video is because Aristotle helped put language and some general logic and frameworks around this idea of freedom. John Locke brought natural rights, the ethics that connect with that, and liberalism to the stage. That negative freedom from authority will allow people to flourish. Adam Smith expanded that idea to economic behaviors, and John Stuart Mill took this further to include a negative freedom around expression. That the government and the church shouldn't oppress dissenting ideas, but rather those ideas are crucial for our progress as a society. He then exercised that freedom to cause a little bit of a wrinkle in this whole thing. So let's talk a little bit about John Stuart Mill. As we highlighted, Mill thought that people should be free to express themselves and put forward dissenting ideas. That we need freedom of thought and expression to truly progress as a society. That we should have intellectual negative freedom. Freedom from the government or the church silencing and limiting intellectual expression. And the reason this was an important idea to him is that Mill was a utilitarian. He thought that the work of philosopher Jeremy Bentham on utilitarianism was right. That what is ethical or moral, or the best way to live and to govern, is to strive to maximize human happiness and minimize human suffering. That it wasn't just about natural rights, but it was one step further. It was about promoting happiness and in turn minimizing harm. This is one of the reasons why he was an early advocate for women's rights. They're human. They deserve happiness, and they should get to participate in activities that exercise reasoning and intellect and so on. That women should have negative freedom, freedom from societal and government oppression. And we're about to hit a turning point here in our discussion, and you might be seeing it starting to unfold. Classical liberalism made a lot of sense for the time. It was a revolt against tyranny. Monarchies, state churches, these authorities had been pressing and restricting people for a long time. And human reasoning was pushing back, pushing for freedom from interference, negative freedom. But with ideas like utilitarianism, you can start to see a question bubbling up. What if we could have authorities or public institutions interfere, but in a good way? In a way that helps contribute to this maximizing of human happiness and minimizing of human suffering. Happening alongside Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill was the Industrial Revolution from 1760-ish to 1830-ish. And we need to briefly revisit an idea that we highlighted when we talked about Aristotle. You can't do what you would like to do, and you have to do what they would like you to do. Now, that was spoken in the context of being a slave, which obviously doesn't highlight the entirety of the problem. The issue of slavery isn't just that you can't do what you would like to do, but that is the issue of leisure. During Aristotle's time, being a freeman was closely connected to having leisure, or time free from obligations and worries, to use your mind and body for enjoyment, self-progress, and progress of your community through active participation in, say, politics. There was an idea that a big, if not the biggest variable to a flourishing life and society was for the people to have leisure. This idea was suppressed through the Middle Ages by the church, but it was revitalized during the Renaissance and continued forward to the time period we're talking about now during the Industrial Revolution. A lot of the negative freedom we've been talking about was so that people could have some time to live leisurely. There was a very close connection to what is ethical and good for a person and for that person to have some time of leisure. So when the Industrial Revolution was in full effect, many felt that this classical liberalism was failing because the working class was, well, it's in the name, working all the time. So they didn't have freedom from obligation in order to be free to participate in leisure. As a result, people started to criticize liberalism, and that critique went something like this. We have this freedom from the government and church interference, which is great, but we need to have the freedom to do stuff too, to have leisure. Maybe we should have some interference to facilitate positive freedoms, or freedoms to do things like get an education, or interference to create standards of living that are at least kind of comparable between social classes. Now, if you're familiar with this positive and negative freedom discussion, you know that there's some disagreement with these terms being used at all. That freedom is just always freedom from something. Positive freedom or freedom to an education is just freedom from barriers to an education, which is absolutely fair, but I'm going to keep using these terms because I personally find they help me make sense of the context of a freedom being discussed. Negative freedoms are usually when someone who could impose is not imposing. Hands off. Let us have the freedom from your imposition. Positive freedoms are usually when someone who could impose does impose in order to create the opportunity for someone to exercise a freedom. Hands on. Interfere in a positive way. And that's what people started to want. Understandably, I think sometimes we forget just how ridiculous things were during this time for the working class. We're talking about a time where children during peak season would start their day at 3 a.m. and work 18 hours a day. Regular season, 12 to 14 hours a day. Children. In textile, they would block out the windows to keep moisture out, so no natural light. Children as young as 3 and 4 years old were working as unpaid helpers. As Blackburn puts it in the book, there's no living without a standard of living. So it really wasn't hard for people to look around and be like, something needs to change. One person who notably gave these critiques was Karl Marx. Marx argued that this negative freedom or freedom from interference was insufficient because it ignores the material conditions that restrict real freedom for the working class. Some freedom for the basic necessities of living and some time for leisure. This idea that public institutions need to help create some standards of living that help us live together in a better social society wasn't necessarily the start, but contributed to the development of various ideas of socialism. This time period is really interesting. We can't cover it all in this video, but there were a lot of different ideas going on about what do we do in this new situation we're in. The Renaissance, printed word, weaponry, the compass, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. Humans are progressing so much during this time. So how do we go about organizing ourselves to live a good, ethical, flourishing life? Remember Nietzsche's quote from the start of this video. We're in a new era as humans, where human reasoning is the foundation. How are we going to handle that? Some ideas weren't great. In 1803, you had Saint Simon in France saying, hey, we should just form a group of intellectual elites that would be used to resolve society's most pressing concerns. Split up society into a two-class system. Around the same time, you had Pierre-Joseph Proudhon saying, property is theft. There was this goal not to go back to the oppressive structures of monarchies and state churches, but to also have some way of leveling the standard of living out enough that people could express their freedoms and have leisure time. Slowly, things started to happen. For example, in 1833, so during the time of John Stuart Mill, the UK passed the Factory Act of 1833, which had the goal of reducing the hours that adults and children could work in the textile industry. Adults could work a 15-hour day from 5:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m., and children ages 9 to 13 could work no more than 9 hours per day, and children under 9 couldn't work. It was a start. Most factories just ignored it, but it was a start. And this type of thing continued. Different democratic socialist societies, feeling like this classical liberalism wasn't producing the individual flourishing it promised, intervened in various ways to improve societal standards. Key to note, I said democratic socialist societies. This implementation of positive freedoms rewired concepts of justice and ethics at the same time. When the surrounding climate of ideas or ethics of the society started to lean in the direction of recognizing a particular freedom that needed intervention to support, and if that was seen as a freedom for the benefit of society, a social justice was therefore being advocated for. And to some, they might say a human right was being advocated for. Now, it feels wrong to skip over communism and 2 world wars, but in the interest of time, we're going to summarize a very complicated 100-year span by looking at a couple key points related to this discussion. Coming out of the feudal system, there was a sentiment that we needed better distribution of materials and wealth, but that this laissez-faire classical liberalism ended up creating a similar problem with the working class being stuck. Socialism, revolutions, trade and labor unions all intermingled in a way to try to address this and create the framework for enough social support to create a more equal standard of living, to create more equal freedoms, one might say. This rolled out throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. In the late 1800s, you saw socialist political philosophies put into action with welfare-related programs, limit on working hours, and so on all through the Western world. But as we've seen, major events that impact people's standard of living tend to lead to new ideas to be tested. But in the spirit of the Renaissance, these new ideas are often just old ideas tweaked. And from 1929 to 1939, during the Great Depression, which rocked the global economy, we were about to see liberalism revisited. From the 1930s to the 1960s-70s, an idea was gaining momentum that these socialist ideas had failed. Unemployment was high, inflation was high, and there was a push to bring back classical liberal ideas, that the government should be less involved and the focus should go towards deregulation and prioritizing a free market. This return to classical liberal ideas, but modernized to keep the good social policies but handle the current problems of the day, is what's referred to as neoliberalism. The general idea was that the freedom we need to prioritize is the freedom to choose, and the freedom of those choices would shape progress. You put the power in the hands of the people through the freedom to choose in a capitalist society. The government and public institutions shouldn't be planning and coming up with ideals to pursue, but rather, through choice and competition, we will see society progress towards whatever the aggregate values of the society are. There was a return to the notion that free markets will handle social issues and provide an opportunity for individuals to be responsible for themselves, reducing the need for welfare-type government interventions. Keep the good stuff that came from democratic socialism, like standardized working hours and conditions and whatnot, but that's it. But in this capitalist economy and society, critics noticed that as governments and economic and legal systems started to embrace this neoliberal approach through how they handled antitrust laws and various things like that, that this creates 2 primary problems. Problems, they argue, we're facing today. The first, monopolies. The second, a hyper-individualism. We're going to talk about the latter Freedom of business is a whole other thing. Let's focus on freedom of the individual. We're starting to enter current times here. The neoliberal idea was that freedom to choose is the best way to allow human flourishing. Try to force it through social programs or socialist economic interventions just mucks it up. That the government will still be there to uphold certain rights, but to exercise those rights to create a good and meaningful life is up to the individual. Some have suggested this creates the social climate to pursue a kind of Nietzschean perspective of a good life, one where we are free to create our own values, free to choose personal projects that correspond to these values, and that this will help create a good, fulfilling life. But that's what critics highlight as a problem of this return to classical liberal ideas, that we're focusing too much on the me, not enough on the we, and that the me is incentivized to be a competitor, not necessarily just an individual and member of a community. And so you're likely seeing this dance happening here. If we want to focus more on the we, that tends to lead to the idea of more positive freedoms, where institutional interference needs to occur to create opportunities. Freedom is always a give and take and is often circumstantial. To balance individual freedoms compared to freedoms for the community or society isn't an easy task. And many political theorists are pointing out that Canada's Justin Trudeau was sort of the last remaining G7 leader from this neoliberal era that we've been in, and that it's now coming to a close and we're about to enter a new phase, whatever that might look like. And this freedom debate is largely based on ethics. Do we have an ethical obligation to promote positive freedoms that restrict some individual freedoms? Or should we focus on negative freedoms where we're hands off except for when things get carried away? In the US, a clear example of this is gun control. Do we limit the freedoms of the me so that the we can be free from the concern of gun violence? Or do we let the me be free and have their guns and we just try to deal with the bad apples? And this applies not only to societal things, but also to how we choose to see our own freedom and our own ethics. If you've made it this far in the video, I hope this next section makes it all worthwhile as we look at what we can do to exercise our freedom in a positive way. Someone who thought this Nietzschean perspective to a fulfilling life had a problem was Simone de Beauvoir. And the problem was that it's selfish. See, Simone de Beauvoir recognized this tension between freedoms and ethics as a me compared to freedoms and ethics as a we, and highlighted that we as people are both of these things. A person exists there in the middle of that tension. They are both simultaneously an individual and a member of a group, be it a family, community, or society. And this ambiguity of existence and the ethical challenges that arise from it aren't to be resolved because they can't, because we're both. That's just how reality is. So we need to work within it. You might feel this yourself. Your personal desires or values or what you think is best might conflict at times with what your desires or values are as a member of your family. You recognize the best action as a family unit, but it conflicts with what's best as an individual. The neoliberal problem, as some have suggested, is that we view it as a personal loss or sacrifice to choose the option that is best for the family unit versus the individual. But you are both. Either way is a give and take, so it doesn't need to be felt like a loss. It's just a choice. And Beauvoir and others would point out that the decisions that people made on behalf of the group, those socialist policies people fought for, they are the giant shoulders we stand upon. My life couldn't even be close to what it is if it wasn't for the continuous efforts people made to create a better society. And that progress likely meant a great deal to those people who fought for it. Typically, the only way anything we do has meaning or feels like it contributes to a good life is in how it connects with others that make up the non-individual side of who we are. If I force my son to hang out with me and love me, that's not really going to contribute to a good life for either one of us. We don't want to be deceived into a good life. We want it to be authentic. As Blackburn puts it in the book, true happiness in this sense requires some correct relationship with our world. It cannot be gained by stoking up sensations within. The good life for the both of us is for us to co-create one another's freedom to spend quality time together. So the meaningful project and best expression of freedom maybe focusing on developing the capabilities and meaningful opportunities for one another, a type of meaningful leisure, which might entail oppressing some individual freedoms. And Beauvoir would say, yes, that's part of it. And that's where the hard work is. To oppress one freedom in the pursuit of creating the opportunity for another requires a tremendous amount of education, contemplation, and understanding of the particular situation, whether it's oppression of a community freedom or an individual freedom, on a societal level and a personal level. It's why continuing education is so important. The more we develop an understanding of what makes for a good life and how we can co-create that good life together as both an individual and a member of a group, that understanding allows us to go about this pursuit thoughtfully and confidently. Hence the book club. It's one way to help us navigate this ambiguity of existence, to know which of our own freedoms we want to turn from in order to create others, be it to create an individual freedom for ourselves by talking with our family or friends about how they can support us, or vice versa. There's no simple answer to this, but continued learning is a great way to have fun in your leisure time and improve your life and the lives you impact. Now, we are in the last couple of weeks of our first book, so if you're interested in joining, now is a really good time. It's a free book club, it's hosted on Discord, and our next books are Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, paired with the novel The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. For more information and to sign up, you can visit www.liftedpages.ca or use the links in the description. This video was a bit of a labor of love, so if you enjoyed it and made it to the end, I'd be very grateful for you to consider subscribing, hitting the thumbs up, and sharing this video with a friend. Thank you for your time. Talk with you next time.